The nationwide protests across the U.S. following the death of African-American George Floyd at the hands of white police officers highlights the long-standing racial divide in America. This, along with the coronavirus pandemic that has disproportionately killed black Americans, well, it has drawn renewed attention to the persistent inequalities in wealth between blacks and whites, despite economic prosperity of recent years. In fact, many say racial inequality has become a normal thing in America, and that this is just the way things are. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Decision 2020. I'm Kaveh Takwai. Today we want to talk about the racial inequality in the U.S. and whether it affects the upcoming presidential vote.
One of the big differences between being a white person and a non-white American is how much money you can make. The typical African-American household has accumulated only about 1/10 the wealth of a typical white family. That gap stems in part from lower rates of home ownership and smaller inheritances among blacks. Based on an analysis conducted by the Brookings Institution, the difference is wider now than it was at the start of the century. And the wealth is all the more important these days since it serves as a safety net during economic downturns.
The poverty rate for blacks in general is much higher than white Americans. It's 20.8% for blacks compared to 8.1% for white Americans. Now, both have trended downward during the economic revival of recent years. Let's see how people feel about this racial division.
I think that the biggest threats are, first, the existential threat of high rates of infection and high rates of death is issue number one. And then second, on the other side of this is the potential prolonged economic devastation of the African-American community. And this is where issues such as racial wealth and income inequality really come to the fore. African-Americans don't have, on average, the type of cushion that allow them to weather these sorts of economic catastrophes. They just do not.
Well, many believe that with the killing of Floyd and all the anti-racism protests in the U.S., Americans might see an actual change in the future. Well, let's ask our guests about this. Today we have with us Amina McLeod. She is an advisory board member at ISPU. We also have with us Jesse Neville from the African People's Socialist Party. Hello to you both. Welcome to Decision 20. Amina McLeod, let me first start with you. The legacy of George Floyd and others have truly jolted the U.S. system overall in making a change for the better when it comes to racial inequality. Now, do you think that'll happen, like many other serious issues that, well, unfortunately seem to have just faded with time?
Well, of course, all of us pray that it will be different this time around. It has jolted many things. It has peeled back the layers, so to speak, of many avenues of inequality here in American society that have been covered over for a very, very long time. Most recently, the policeman that killed George Floyd has been released from jail on bail and allowed to leave the state. So that has caused a new angst.
Okay, let's move on to Jesse Neville. Jesse Neville, you're from a party by the name of African People's Socialist Party. If you don't mind, tell us what your relationship is, first of all, in terms of your platform with African American people, and also why you feel solidarity with them. And of course, what are your views on the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath in terms of the exposure that has happened between whites and blacks and the division that is?
Well, Uhuru, I want to appreciate Press TV for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I would like to also salute the people of Iran for your righteous stance in opposition to U.S. imperialism and declare my solidarity with the people of Iran. With regards to your question, I think, what I understand from working under the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the African People's Socialist Party is that what has happened with the resistance of African people in the United States in response to the murder of George Floyd, which was not an unusual incident. African people are murdered and brutalized and tortured every single day by the police in this country, and that has been the case as long as African people have been in this country. What happened with the resistance is that it exposed the true nature of this social system to the world.
Okay, we appreciate those comments by you, Jesse. We're going to get back to you later, including Amina, to talk with you guys about some of the other issues. Well, the current pandemic has also laid bare the inequalities in the U.S. healthcare system. One reason why Americans or Black Americans have been hit harder is because they're less likely to have health insurance.
Official figures show that African Americans are less likely to have health insurance. This holds true even among the employed. Black workers are 60% more likely to be uninsured than white workers. Along with a lack of coverage, Black Americans have higher rates of chronic illnesses, including diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. All these conditions contribute to making the coronavirus pandemic all the more deadly for Blacks than for whites, who account for more than 60% of the population, but only about 53% of the deaths from the virus. Higher rates of infection and death among minorities demonstrate the racial character of inequality in America.
This past week saw the first town hall debate take place, unprecedented in its kind. Well, since it hasn't really been done before in this format, replacing the actual one-to-one debate. Now, one of the standout moments was this African American asking a question from presidential candidate Joe Biden.
Besides "you ain't black," what do you have to say to young Black voters who see voting for you as further participation in a system that continually fails to protect them?
Well, in case you don't know, Biden, in one of his interviews, said, "You ain't black if you're still deciding between him and Trump."
We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Anyways, this was the teen's question.
Well, it's awful hard to get the money, depending on the background, what your economic background is, to get a down payment. So we're going to guarantee first-term home buyers a $15,000 down payment.
I mean, $15,000, Joe Biden, that ain't a whole lot when it comes to an apartment, let alone a house. Anyways, that teen actually was quite enlightened. I mean, his terminology, his ideology was more in the league of what some of these independent and third-party candidates are saying.
I'm everything the Republican Party is afraid of and everything the Democrats still haven't found a place for. I'm a green, and green is the color of growth, of change.
Well, for Trump supporters, I say, I completely understand why you voted for Trump. He came in as an outsider. He said, I'm a businessman. I know how to balance the budget. I know how to cut spending. And by the way, I'll bring the troops home as well. And yet he's done none of that. And I would say I'm the outsider that you were looking for in Trump in 2016.
I look around and I'm concerned by the state of our nation. What happened to the days when we could engage in civil discourse?
In our previous programs, we've talked about the third-party candidates and independents. In the case of the racial inequality that exists in the U.S., obviously they have their thoughts on this and the way that it should be dealt with, which is not the way that the U.S. President Donald Trump has dealt with the racial divisions in the U.S., especially the ones that have arisen because of these protests. Now, in terms of the third-party candidates, we'd like to find out what our guest, Amina McLeod, thinks. We're going to bring her back in to ask her about that. Amina, the third-party candidates and independents, even though it appears that they don't have mass popularity behind them, but they are speaking the voice of many Americans, especially when it comes to, for example, racial inequality and the protests.
Oh, I don't think many people know much about the third-party candidates, unfortunately. And so they see Biden as their reluctant only choice. And I think that bothers a great deal of people, but they know that voting for Trump is a really bad thing.
Okay, let's bring Jesse back in here. Jesse, the same question to you, really. I mean, are black and ethnic minorities automatically going to be drawn to Biden due to Trump's terrible handling of the racial discrimination protests? Do you think that's the case?
I think what I would say in response to that is I would point to the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations, which has planned a major mobilization in Washington, D.C., November 6th through the 8th. They're calling it the Black People's March on the White House. And this is a massive demonstration that's being planned right there in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C., regardless of who wins the election that will be held the Tuesday prior to that weekend. So whether it is Joseph Biden who comes into that seat or whether it is Donald Trump who is reelected, the Black community in the form of the Black is Back Coalition is planning to come out and resist and wage this demonstration, because regardless of who wins, what they're saying is that it doesn't matter. African people are going to lose, regardless of whether Joseph Biden or Donald Trump wins. It's the same colonial system. It's the same parasitic capitalist system built on the theft of resources, built on police murder, mass incarceration, genocide, the theft of the land from the indigenous people, from the Mexican people, the mass deportations, the profiteering from the COVID-19 colonial virus pandemic that has ravaged the Black community. None of this is going to change regardless of who gets elected.
Okay, we appreciate that. That's Jesse talking to us there. He is from the African People's Socialist Party. And of course, we'd like to also thank Amina McLeod, Advisory Board Member of the ISPU. So let's move on now and take a look at some social media posts and see what Americans are actually saying about the racial division in their country. Our first tweet comes from Samuel Perry. When someone says systemic racism is a myth, demand they explain persistent racial inequality, assuming they don't want to say minorities are born inferior. Our next one takes a look at from Mackenzie St. Ford, says actually that big corporations are protecting bad cops because racism, racial inequality is the rule. Since the white dude overtakes America, then that is the case. Corporations do seem to always have a hand in terms of how their tentacles are spread within the U.S. System, whether it's on the social side and, of course, whether it's on the corporate side. Now, here's the thing. Are there exchanges between Americans and the candidates on core issues? I mean, isn't that important? Or is there just Trump bashing and Biden bashing over the same set of mainstream issues?
They're a controlled opposition party. They're not here to win. They're here to make sure you either vote Democrat, and the Republicans are there to make sure you vote Republican, so you don't look up, so you don't realize that your vote doesn't count like the way you want it to count, because our system is broken and it is supposed to be broken. It is supposed to function this way, so you continue participating in this stupid facade and start vote shaming third parties.
Anyways, if Black Americans are more likely to suffer from a deadly disease like coronavirus, it's because those elements are tied to the segregation and are concentrated in poverty, which obviously plagues their communities. The summer of 2020 has been a season of rage and anti-racism rallies across the U.S. The protests were mostly against police brutality and racial disparities in the country. However, the massive demonstrations attracted another group as well. Pro-Donald Trump armed militiamen hit the streets to confront the demonstrators.
Advocates like you bring us closer to our founding ideals. Muslim American voices matter.
All right, time now to take a look at the debates. Well, the first one was a presidential debate. The second one was a town hall. In both, we're focusing on how Trump replied to the white supremacists in terms of his views on it. Let's take a listen.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by. I denounce white supremacy, okay?
You did
I've
2 days
denounced
later.
white supremacy for years. He may be
Why not
right.
just say it's
Can I be
crazy
honest?
and not true?
He may be right. I just don't know about QAnon.
You do know.
I don't know. No, I don't know.
Okay, there you heard it. Both views are what Trump has actually displayed. Now, The group Proud Boys that Trump has called, for example, during the debate also expressed support for the U.S. president.
People are angry, and they may not necessarily be angry at one another personally, but if you look at the big picture, they're angry at the direction that the city's heading, that this country's heading, and everybody's pointing the finger at each other. And that could be dangerous.
Yes, that could be dangerous. It could be very dangerous. Obviously, we are looking at whether these types of comments actually spell division. Well, joining us in this segment is Gladys Mitchell-Walthour, professor of public policy at the University of Wisconsin. And we also have with us Kyla Papuchet, activist and commentator at anticonquista.com. Hello and welcome to you both. Gladys, first to you. The U.S. president refusing to condemn white supremacy and militia armed groups, giving these groups a green light to continue causing violence and disruption as we have seen. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that these groups are making these type of claims simply to lead or to get people to not vote. And when I say people, they are basically trying to demobilize minority groups, and which would then help the current president's political party. So.
Wow, that's very interesting. Kyla, our guests are talking about how this may actually have people not come out and vote. I mean, the fact that the U.S. president is refusing to condemn white supremacy and these militia groups. What is your take on that? I mean, is this something that is a cause for worry when it comes to voting, for example?
So Trump has done a successful job at making it seem like to his supporters that everyone is against them, that the whole world is against them, that the country is against him. He's made it seem that our institutions are so deeply entrenched with Democrat and liberal capitalist hegemony that anything a little to the right will be persecuted. He's truly made them believe that the right is being persecuted by the left, when in reality it is quite the opposite.
Okay, very good. We're going to get back to Gladys and also Kyla there regarding the issue at hand. And of course, what Kyla said was pretty interesting because she focused on actually both parties and how it doesn't serve the African Americans, for example. Anyways, when we take a look at how things are transpiring in the U.S., it's interesting how Trump supporters are saying that if Joe Biden wins the upcoming presidential vote in November, it means nothing but election fraud. You heard that from our guest. They've even warned that they won't take it easy or take the vote or the result of the vote easily and will move forward with open rebellion.
Donald Trump's refusal to condemn white supremacy and militia violence during the first presidential debate fits into a pattern of extremist rhetoric that has already stoked fear of voting fraud. This came after Trump urged his supporters to descend on polling stations in November's election. Experts have already warned that Trump's encouragement of people to scramble to polling stations could have horrific consequences.
I fear that we might have a potential civil war brewing. I fear that we're not going to have a safe transfer of power, or if Trump is reelected.
Trump's comments on voter fraud needs to be expanded more on. We need to cover it a little bit more because this fits a pattern of the president seemingly attempting to actually intimidate voters. Last time around, we didn't get enough from our guest, Gladys. We're going to bring her back in. Gladys Mitchell-Walthour, who's a professor of public policy. Gladys, we need your ideas about voter fraud. I mean, when you take a look at how Trump has alluded to that happening, especially with the mail-in voting, what are your thoughts on it? What's going to happen? I mean, the energy is racially charged in the U.S., and now voter fraud on top of that. What may transpire?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. And the current president isn't the first political candidate or, person in office, and I'm talking about politicians at all levels, to use this strategy, right? And the strategy is to cause division among people so that people actually won't unite and won't talk about other issues, such as stratification, class stratification, and things like that.
Okay, Kyla, our subject at hand, since it's about African Americans, I need to ask from you the way that Trump may draw in those votes. Now, some are saying that Trump has actually done a lot for the African American community. That falls, of course, in stark contrast to the way that he has talked about African Americans, especially when it came to the protest. How do you think he's going to be able to have an appeal for African Americans?
It's far gone for him to win any other people that were formerly against him in the Black and brown community, in the ethnic community. What I can say, though, is that he does have supporters that are ethnic, and those supporters are extremely wealthy, mostly extremely wealthy, and would have likely voted for a Republican anyway. And Trump has this character that some Americans find really enticing, is that while we have some politicians who pretend to be all hoity-toity and play politics, Trump is very honest, and this is something that they value, his honesty of how violent he is. At least he's honest about it.
Okay, very good. Let me thank our guest. That was Kayla there talking. Kayla Papuchet, who's an activist and commentator at anticonquista.com, and also Gladys Mitchell-Waltower, who's a professor of public policy at the University of Wisconsin. Okay, on to social media. It's filled with posts endorsing and condemning Trump's comments. We picked a couple of them. First one here, still alleged, could be LARPing, could be some Fed psyop. These Trump-hating militia types attract all sorts of lunatics that are often infiltrated or run by the feds. That's a good point. Some of them were actually out in the streets promoting some of the governors and taking care of security. This one says Trump, as president of the U.S., must be seen and not heard to be inviting or invoking a call to militia. At what point do the scales of blindness drop off? At what point do you need to see that Trump is using the highest office to invoke chasms and schisms of unrest? Very true and right to the point there. We also have then this tweet. This tweet says there's no easy target to blame for the mess the U.S. is in. It's a two-party system which is prone to be averse in a country all too comfortable with aggression. It's a culture steeped in white supremacy. It's a deficient education system that doesn't teach history. Okay, time for a look at some of the headlines for the week ending Saturday, October 17. I got about 30 seconds to cover it. First, Biden's ABC town hall viewership tops Trump's NBC, MSNBC, and CNBC event in big surprise win. Of course, that needs to be updated. Now, when it comes to early voting, our second piece of news, voters have cast a total of over 24 million ballots in the reporting states. Democrats outvoting Republicans 2-1. And our final one is an AP poll. Voters see the nation as fundamentally divided, question U.S. democracy. And last one, Trump on if Biden wins, quote, maybe I'll have to leave the country.
Running against the worst candidate in the history of presidential politics puts pressure on me. Could you imagine if I lose my whole life? What am I going to do? I'm going to say, I lost to the worst candidate in the history of politics. I'm not going to feel so good. Maybe I'll have to leave the country. I don't know.
We're almost out of time for this episode, but before I let you go, first let's look at what was picked as the quote of the week. And no, it wasn't one of the candidates. Drum roll, please.
So even after election time, when is the next time that someone from the Democratic Party will come to my neighborhood to see what's going on in my neighborhood, to see why crime is so high, to see why we're killing one another, see why we're, there's no jobs, there's even no after-school programming for kids.
But I would like to leave you with someone's thoughts on the U.S. president and how he actually tackled COVID-19. For that, we went all the way to Syria. That's right. This is Aziz Asmar, a Syrian artist. Here he's painting a mural showing U.S. President Donald Trump fighting the coronavirus on the wall of a destroyed home. Now, don't forget the U.S. supported the war and therefore the destruction that followed, and is responsible also for the harshest sanctions on the nation of Syria and its people.
ورود أخبار عن إصابة ترامب هو وعائلته بداء الكورونا. ترامب يلي دائما بيتعاطى بالسخرية مع كل الأحداث السياسية اللي بتصير في العالم، حتى اللي فيها مآسي، حتى اللي فيها جائحة الكورونا. نتيجة استخفافه بهذا الداء بهذه الجائحة أصيب بالكورونا.
Thank you for watching us, and don't forget to catch our next episode. I've been Kaveh Tagway. On behalf of the whole team here, it's goodbye until the next Decision 2020.